All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our presentation on Senate Bill 712 on the Water Quality Performance Standards. My name is Melissa Lawrence, and I'm one of the Bureau Chiefs here in Regulation for the South Florida Water Management District. Joining me today from our Regulation Division, I have Jill Creech, our Division Director, Jess Markle, the other Bureau Chief, and Glenn Garreau, one of our lead engineers in regulation. We'll also have Emily Johnson in our Office of Counsel. So our agenda for today is we're going to start with Jess Markle is going to go over a presentation outlining the changes in the applicant's handbook, volume 1 in sections 8 and 9, and then also updating you on the applicant's handbook, volume 2. And then after a break to change presenters, Glenn Garreau is going to be going over stormwater design examples, a couple different stormwater design examples with you. And then we will go into a question and answer session. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jess Markle, and he's going to be going over a presentation with you on the applicant's handbook.
Good afternoon, everyone. First part of this will be going over sections 8 and 9 of volume 1 of the ERP handbook. So by way of a little history, in 2020, the governor signed the Clean Waterway Act into law that directed the DEP and the 5 water management districts to enter into rulemaking. In February of 2023, the rule was adopted after various workshops, and it was sent to the House and Senate for ratification because the cost of the bill to the regulated community was going to exceed $1 million over 5 years. Neither the House nor the Senate took it up in that session, but they did in 2024, at which point the rule was ratified and signed into law June 28th, 2024. It did become effective with various and sundry grandfathering provisions, many of which have pushed off the implementation of the rule until now. Some resources that you'll become acquainted with from the DEP is the ERP Stormwater Resource Center, where they have a number of different publications and guidance on the rule. Amongst those is a grandfathering flow chart. We're not going to show it here, but these links are live, and when we make the presentations available to you all, you'll be able to use them to navigate there. Now, one of the critical grandfathering dates comes up in just a little less than 60 days, and that is December 28th of this year. At which point, if your application, for those of you that have ERP applications under review, those applications are not complete, those new water quality performance standards will come into effect. Complete in this context means no further RAIs. It does not mean you have to have a permit in hand. We do ask that as we approach that date, you prioritize responding to RAIs for any applications you have that are non-grandfathered. If you have a circumstance in which your project is not going to have these performance criteria come into effect till later on, we ask that you hold off responding to those so we can focus on folks who are trying to get in and become complete before the end of this year. Moving into the heart of the rule and the criteria as they are presented into volume 1, there is a performance criteria flowchart that is also available in the DEP's website. You'll see snippets of it as we go through the design examples. It is a very informative graphical way to work through what criteria are going to apply to your projects. Because as you're going to hear as I move through this part of the presentation, there are a number of different paths a project can take and a few different criteria that may end up being applicable. So the first is the standard for all sites, and that is a combination of an 80% reduction in total phosphorus and a 55% reduction in total nitrogen from your project. As you consider that criteria, you must also evaluate a net improvement of phosphorus and nitrogen in comparing the post-development to the pre. We do have a definition of pre-development, and it is the site condition at the time you make application. So a project that had been farmed decades past and has been laying vacant, that is not your pre-development. Your pre-development is that vacant, unused land at the time you make application. The next standard we move to is for those projects that will be upstream and discharging to an outstanding Florida water, at which point those criteria increase to a 90% reduction for phosphorus and an 80% reduction in nitrogen. And parallel to that, you still must consider what a net improvement of phosphorus and nitrogen will be. And in each time, it is the more stringent of those two bulleted items that you see that will govern as to what standards you have to meet for your project. Once we move to the next most stringent set of criteria, it's for those projects that are within an impaired water body. If you are not upstream of an impaired water body, but you are simply within an area that has one, and you are not discharging to an OFW, then your criteria becomes 80% for both phosphorus and nitrogen. If you are going to be discharging to an outstanding Florida water, that criteria elevates to 95% for each of those pollutants. Again, net improvement is a backstop, and you also have to look at what pollutants are causing the impairment and able to demonstrate a net improvement in those. Not all impairments are related to phosphorus and nitrogen. Moving into the scenario in which your project is within an area with a adopted TMDL, total maximum daily load, or a basin management action plan, BMAP, your criteria will potentially change in that you need to have a level of treatment at the basin specific level that will meet those TMDLs. Now, this is not a requirement to meet the generic allocation or the general allocation for a much larger area. My example is the Lake Okeechobee watershed. That watershed has an adopted TMDL of 105 metric tons annually, but your project will need to have a basin-specific criteria. And at present, there have been none adopted. But this rule is in place in anticipation of sometime in the future when a basin-specific TMDL may be adopted in particular areas. There are considerations for redevelopment, which does have a definition. That is anything that is not agriculture that is already in effect with no existing permit, and which the existing impervious is going to be removed and replaced either with the same or less impervious area. The change in your land use has to result in a less than or equal to event mean concentration for both phosphorus and nitrogen. When you have a redevelopment, you can meet the standards that I've just gone over. You can elect to do that, or you can have the option of meeting the 80% reduction in phosphorus and a 45% reduction in nitrogen, unless you are discharging to an OFW in which those standards are raised to 90% and 60% respectively. We do have to see a net improvement in the pollutants causing an impairment if you are within and upstream of an impairment. There is an exemption to be under consideration. It will be processed under the commonly called de minimis exemption in statute. There are criteria as listed here. The project has to be particularly small, less than an acre. You cannot be discharging to an impaired water body nor an OFW. Your impervious area has to be going down. Your pollutant loading has to be going down. And then you do need to provide us supporting information that demonstrates that there are some site condition that is preempting you from being able to meet the criteria that would otherwise apply. Now with that, those lay out the rules and the criteria. I'm going to move now into a high-level discussion of the calculations behind all this. The first thing to make note of is your location in the state is incredibly important. This rule looks at hydrologic unit code 12 on the USGS delineation scale, if you will. And from that, kind of all things flow in terms of whether or not you're in an upstream, whether or not you're within an OFW that is within the HUC 12, or you're in an impaired water in the HUC 12. So it's very important that you locate that. And that link on the screen will direct you to a GIS utility that the DEP has provided that provides all these HUC boundaries for the entire state. It provides layers for waters not achieving standards, which is the longer term for an impaired water body. It also gives you TMDL boundaries as well as the outstanding Florida waters. So it's a highly valuable resource And again, these links are active when you receive the presentation after we conclude. So once you figured out where you are in the world, you're going to start doing a couple different sets of calculations. One will be your pre and post development. Again, that is the backstop requirement for all projects. In order to calculate these things, you'll need to understand what rainfall you have. This method is based on an average annual rainfall, not on a particular storm event. Maps have been developed that break the state down into hydrologic zones, meteorological zones, pardon me. And then from there, there's a map of isopleths that give essentially contours of rainfall in that cumulative. We'll see some graphics here shortly. You're going to need to find your land use, both pre and post. In both those conditions, you'll also have to calculate your percentage of directly connected impervious area. And we do have a few places located throughout Applicants 1 where DCIA is defined. The more obvious things, it is building an impermeable pavement. It is areas that drain directly into your stormwater management system, including any kind of conveyance or storm sewer. Later on in section 9.2, we get into a little more quantification. You need to look at concentrated shallow flow over a short pervious area. Just because you've got a 1 foot strip of grass between a parking lot and a lake does not mean it is not directly connected. One important note when you calculate this is this percentage is based on the total development. So you take that directly connected impervious area, divide it by the entire project. It is not just a percentage of the impervious areas. So we also have a discussion of what non-DCIA is, and those are all pervious areas would fall in that category. But it would also be impervious area that flow over at least 10 feet of undisturbed pervious areas with a very well-drained profile, such as an HSG, hydrologic soil group A or B soil. You can also flow over 20 feet of undisturbed pervious that isn't HSG, A or B soils, but you do have to demonstrate there's sufficient infiltration to handle a 3-year, 1 hour runoff volume. You'll need your curve number for that non-DCIA. From all of that, you will calculate or use a lookup table to find a runoff coefficient. You will also use that information, the combination of percentage DCIA and curve number, to find your event mean concentrations. These are in rule. We are going to hold to these unless you have a regional or local government study that gives a different value, and we will need to review and vet that as part of your permit application. So with all that, you'll go and determine your actual required load reduction. First, you'll calculate your net improvement requirement. That'll be that post-development load, which and you'll subtract from it your pre-development load. You will also, in a parallel calculation, do the percent reduction. You'll take that prescribed percentage that I've rattled off, depending on where you are and what kind of downstream water bodies you have, and you'll multiply that by the post-development load that your project would generate without any BMPs. Then once you do that, you're going to select the greatest reduction for both phosphorus and nitrogen. And it is possible that pre-post net improvement might govern for one of your pollutants, while your percentage reduction would govern for another. I've got a very, very kind of crude table here to try to illustrate that. In this particular example, in the net improvement, I would have to address 100 pounds of phosphorus and 150 pounds of nitrogen. By the percent reduction, I would only have to address 120 in the phosphorus and 80 in the nitrogen. So in this case, my percent reduction would govern for phosphorus and my nitrogen would be governed by the pre-post. My apologies, my screen is locked up. I'm gonna have to take a small break while I resolve this. Glenn, for some reason, my Adobe is frozen. Can you bring up the presentation and share your screen, please?
Yes, give me just one moment.
All right, so the rainfall data that I mentioned, you'll find that in Appendix M of Volume 1. The graphic on the right is that delineation of the state into these 5 meteorological zones. And then from that, we have the isopleph map that allows you to determine what will be the governing average annual rainfall that you use for your analysis. From there, we'll start to select and calculate BMPs. We're not going to go over every possible BMP. The list can be a little exhaustive, but I do want to highlight maybe some of the more common ones and those that are parallel to what we have been using up to this point to treat stormwater runoff. So in Appendix O, we've got a table of these and a list of the various calculations that govern them. The first is wet detention, your good old-fashioned pond. Critical for that is to determine your permanent pool volume, which is going to be from the bottom of that lake to the seasonal high water table. From that, you'll generate a residence time. That is the key factor. That's what drives the efficiency removal percentage for a wet detention facility. That runoff volume is based on the rainfall that you would have calculated based on the curves, along with a runoff coefficient that you would have found in a lookup table based on what zone you're in, as well as your percentage of DCIA and your curve number. Regardless of what the math says, you may find that your lake will calculate a permanent pool volume and a residence time in excess of 200 days, especially here in South Florida, where we tend to have pretty deep lakes. But we cannot exceed 200 days. There is a ceiling. So if you find yourself with a lake over 200 days, 200 is what you're going to use in the equations to calculate your efficiency. We'll move into retention. That is the volume being retained, and in a surface facility, that will be from the bottom to the top of bank. You'll need to calculate your retention depth. That's what drives the efficiency removal for phosphorus and nitrogen in these kinds of facilities. And that is pretty simply the runoff volume divided by the area contributing that runoff. We are also limited to an upper threshold here of 4 inches. And then your volume, that volume that you are retaining for water quality does need to recover in 72 hours or less. And a recovery analysis is something that we will be requiring of folks to submit with their applications. So in that wet detention environment, for those of you that are thinking to maximize all of the reduction potential that a wet pond is going to afford you, one thing you can look at is a littoral zone. The load reduction for a littoral zone is limited. It's capped at 10%. You do need to have a planting plan. Tell us what it is you're going to plant. We're looking for vegetation that's going to survive in a varying water condition. That littoral zone needs to be 20% of the lake area at minimum. And there does need to be a perpetual monitoring and maintenance plan that amongst other things discusses the harvesting of that biomass. Keeping within the boundary of the lake, we have stormwater harvesting. This is irrigating out of your pond. Need to calculate your irrigated area. Obviously, you're not going to be irrigating impervious, so make sure that your irrigated area is at no greater than your pervious area. The volume that you're going to have is going to be based on the control elevation of the lake to the invert of any bleeder or weir in a control structure that will allow discharge. You're going to calculate your irrigation rate based on that volume and your irrigated acreage. This rate cannot be greater than any allocation that you are applying for through a water use permit. And those two permits will need to be reviewed concurrently with one another. Since the stormwater harvesting is going to be used as a water quality BMP, it becomes very critical that we have reasonable assurance that you're going to be able to get that allocation in a water use permit. So exfiltration is another one that we especially expect to see or continue to see in our more southern reaches. Same equations that you all have used for quite a long time, maybe rearranged algebraically to solve for volume instead of solving for length, but it'll be the same factors. You'll need to know how long a trench you're going to have, how wide, your saturated and unsaturated trench depths, your hydraulic conductivity, and the driving head. And just as before, that hydraulic conductivity does need to be based on site-specific data. And then once you have the volume, you can calculate a retention depth. That is simply going to be your exfiltrated volume divided by the area of your catchment. And again, because this is a retention BMP, it is going to be limited to no more than 4 inches over the runoff area. So as we wrap up our discussion on section 9, we're going to talk about offsite water. If you are bringing in discharge from another area, if it's accepted into your water management system, it must be accounted for in your water quality requirements. So whatever load is being introduced from that offsite area, that is an input into your system and does need to be calculated as part of your overall reduction criteria. So with that, I'm going to move into the conforming changes that were made in volume 2. In effect, the lion's share of the water quality criteria that were previously in volume 2 have been moved into volume 1 or outright superseded. So if we can move on, and we'll see some specifics. So in section 3.8, where we discuss minimum drainage, these next few slides are really going to speak to what historically was the dry pretreatment requirement for commercial and industrial systems. So in the case where you're designing a larger commercial industrial system, a commerce park or something like that, and development may occur in phases as different lots are built out, and you're designing the master stormwater management system, at least 20% of the load reduction has to be done in that master system. And we want that in a retention BMP. And by 20%, what I mean here is if you have to reduce your load by 100 kilograms per year, then 20 kilograms per year needs to be accomplished in a retention BMP. Now, the extension of that is for commercial industrial projects that maybe aren't part of a larger plan of common development, but it's the same theme. We want to see 20% of the required load reduction occurring in a retention BMP or a separate containment system. For projects that discharge directly to particularly sensitive water bodies that we want to have an elevated level of protection for, and you have a 40% impervious area or greater, we also need to see 20% of that load reduction done in a retention system. So there's a list here. Depending on where you are in our district, you're more or less familiar with these. But what you'll see is these are all water bodies of particular concern, and we want to make sure that the water quality that potentially reaches those water bodies is meeting the highest possible standard. It's a continuation of that list. I won't take any time to read it to you. So again, littoral zones, I've discussed those already, but they are a part of our wet detention design and performance criteria. Reiterated here is that that overall area of littoral zone needs to be no less than 20% of the lake area. And with that, we'll take a brief break, and then Glenn will step in and walk you through a couple design examples that illustrate some of the criteria and methods that I've introduced.
So Melissa, if you go ahead and release the screen.
I have, you should be good to share, Glenn.
Thank you. Let's see, did that work? Can everyone see my screen? Water quality design examples, Glenn Garreau, PE. And can everyone hear me?
We can see your screen and we can hear you, Glenn, so you're all set to start.
Perfect. So I'm going to give a little disclaimer here. Throughout the presentation this morning, I've been getting warnings that I have a bad internet connection. So if I get stuck, that may be why. But with that said, my name is Glenn Garreau. I'm an engineer here at the district in our Okeechobee Service Center. I'm going to go over a couple of examples today on how these new BMPs and some old BMPs and these new performance standards can be applied. And so with that, let's get into it. And so these examples are just illustrative. They're just meant for reference purposes only. They're not specific projects. Your projects might be different. The locations will be different. The VMPs that you choose will be different. So again, this is just for illustrative purposes and reference purposes, not necessarily how you must do anything relative to these project types and VMPs. So the first project we're going to talk about is a single-family residential project where the pre-development condition was Marl Prairie. That's one of the undeveloped land uses you'll find on table 9.2 in Handbook 1. So let's take a look. So a basic site plan, and I'm going to try to zoom in, so bear with me so you guys can see this. But this is a basic site plan. We've got a couple acres of lake. We've got some preserve area in our project. We've got some dry retention areas in our project. Our project is located in St. Lucie County. It's about 33.6 acres, and it is going to discharge directly to the North Fork of the St. Lucie River. The North Fork of the St. Lucie River in this location is impaired, has an adopted TMDL, and it is an aquatic preserve and OFW. So as Jess pointed out earlier when going over the various criteria in Section 8 of Handbook 1, this project will need to meet that high standard of 95% reduction for both nitrogen and for phosphorus. So let's take a look. All right, so a couple more things about our project. And I'm going to try to get as much of this as big as I can here. Bear with me. So our project area is single family. Like I said, it's in St. Lucie County. We looked up using the DEP GIS tool that Jess mentioned. There are others out there you can use and find, but that's an easy one to use. It will give you the HUC 12s. It'll give you the waters not achieving standards, impairments, and the TMDLs if adopted. So we have our HUC 12 number. Yes, it is an impaired basin. Yes, there is an impairment downstream. Yes, the downstream water body within our HUC is also an OFW. So scrolling down a little bit about our project's land use, we've got 33.6 acres. We've got 4 acres of building, 3 acres of roads and parking, 3.3 acres of lake, almost 2.5 acres of dry retention, and 9.3 of pervious area. We also have 10.87 acres of the site that's going to be preserved. And so that's important to understand as our catchment area for the purposes of calculating water quality under these new performance standards will not need to include those preservation areas. So we're going to right here go ahead and subtract out from our project area our preserve areas to come up with our catchment area or our area of focus for our water quality performance standards of 22.73 acres. All right, and here we have some information about groundwater levels, seasonal high water levels in our receiving system. And so we can move on to our calculation of various volumes. Let's make sure here we go. So the treatment standard, as Jess pointed out, and I just reiterated, comes from section 8.3.4 of Handbook 1. And as we've determined, it's 95% for nitrogen and phosphorus. And as we mentioned, it also must meet a pre versus post evaluation as well. And the greater of either constituent for either nitrogen or phosphorus must be the requirement. And in this case, there is no commercial proposed within our site plan, so we do not need to address section 4.1.1, where Jess was just mentioning the 20% must be in a retention BMP. That will not be applicable to our project here. We will have one after this that will do that, so stay tuned. All right, so water quality treatment calculations. The first thing we got to assess is all of our basic parameters. And so, as Jess showed earlier, you go to Appendix M of Handbook 1, and we see the meteorological zone map. We're in Zone 2, and we can also determine from our site location our annual runoff depth of 57 inches per year. Our existing land use category is Marl Prairie, and we have there listed the EMCs found in section 9.2 or table 9.2 of Handbook 1. I want to pause here and point out an important key factor or key point regarding EMCs in table 9.2. Many of you maybe on this presentation have seen or have obtained other EMC data sets from other studies done around the state. The DEP has compiled all of that and developed what we have now in Handbook 1 as Table 9.2. You must use the data that's in Table 9.2. So if you're whatever tool you're using, make certain that you're using the data in Table 9.2. It is different than other models, tools, and prior studies that have been done around the state. So can't emphasize enough. Please always reference Table 9.2 for your EMC values. So a little bit about the rest of our existing condition. We have a CD type soil. We have no impervious area. It's completely undeveloped. We have a DCIA obviously of 0 since we have no imperviousness. But if we had to calculate our percent DCIA, dividing our impervious area, which is 0 over our total, still gives us 0% DCIA. We have our pervious area or our catchment area of 22.73, our study area. And we can calculate a non-DCI curve number. And as Jess pointed out, I'm going to just do the math here as an exercise. You could have both pervious and impervious areas within your catchment that is considered non-DCIA, areas that are not directly connected. So here we have the equation for calculating what that non-DCIA curve number is. So it's your pervious curve number multiplied by your pervious area plus your impervious curve number times your impervious area divided by the sum. And in this case, we plug in the values and we end up at 89 as our non-DCIA curve number. So moving to the next step, we need to establish based on our non-DCIA curve number and our percent DCIA, we can go to Appendix N and of the ERP Handbook Volume 1. There are tables, various tables based on those two parameters where you determine the annual runoff coefficient. And if we go to those tables with those parameters that we just calculated, we will determine our runoff coefficient of 0.226. You may have to linearly interpolate, but that will be the starting point for calculating the total runoff. Understand, as Jess pointed out, this methodology is all based on an annual amount of runoff volume. And much of that and much of the data that we have in Handbook 1 was originally published by the DEP in a study they did in 2007 of the efficiencies of the various BMPs around our state. And in that same 2007 DEP report, it comes up with a methodology for calculating an annual amount of runoff. So you'll see those same things in that older study, as you will find in the appendix of Applicant's Handbook Volume 1. So we've got to calculate our annual runoff volume. So we simply take our catchment area and we multiply it by our rainfall depth and our runoff coefficient that we just established. And here we go, plugging them in 22.73, 57 inches per year, our runoff coefficient, we now have established our runoff volume on an annual basis in the units of acre feet per year. Let's now figure out, now that we have our volume of runoff, what is our mass of our loads? And so we take that volume and we simply multiply it by our event mean concentrations based on our land uses. And of course, we're going to need to convert from the English units of acre feet per year to metric units of kilograms per year. So we have, all of the unit conversions listed here, essentially 1.233. We multiply that for our unit conversion times our annual runoff volume of 24.4 acre feet per year times our EMC, and we come up with our annual mass loading for phosphorus and our annual mass loading for nitrogen based on the two different EMCs that we established for our land use. So now we have established our existing load of 0.361 for total phosphorus and our existing load of total nitrogen of 20.54 in kilograms per year. So now we need to take a look at our load for the project, the proposed single-family residential. Once again, we need to establish what our EMCs are. Once again, I'm going to emphasize we need to be looking at table 9.2, not other sources, to establish the correct EMC to meet these new performance standards. So for single family, we have our EMCs for phosphorus and nitrogen as indicated, 0.327 milligrams per liter and 1.77. Take a look at our site conditions. We have a hydrologic soil type C. We have some impervious area. We have a directly connected impervious area of 7.65. I'm not going to go into a bunch of detailed calculations. We'll have some here. But as Jess pointed out, you'll need to establish what that is for your project's design. There are definitions in Handbook 2, as Jess pointed out. So be sure that you're meeting those definitions and you're providing those tabulations. I want to stop here and just emphasize as a key point, we have not been seeing these and we're constantly asking for these calculations with these project evaluations under the current rule in the pre-post scenario. So please provide those supporting calculations and site plans and mapping that go with it. So moving on, we now can calculate our directly connected percent impervious area by doing the math of our impervious area over our catchment, and we determine that we have a DCI percentage in our proposed condition of 33.66%. So that's a key number. We need to remember that. And we have our pervious area of 9.3. We have a curve number of 74 for our pervious area. Curve numbers can come from various sources and methods. We've listed here the most common, which is the USDA NRCS TR55, one of my favorites. But there are other national publications that have curve numbers in them. But if you go back to the original source of this methodology, that is where they got their curve number. So we suggest you do the same. So we can calculate our non-DCI curve number as we were showing before, our 74 for our pervious areas, 98 for our impervious areas, and we do the math and we come up with our non-DCI curve number of 74. And in this instance, we can also take those two values, our non-DCI curve number, our percentage of DCIA, we go back to Appendix N of the Applicant's Handbook Volume 1 to establish our runoff coefficient, our annual runoff coefficient for our proposed condition. And there we have it there at 0.322. So now we can calculate how much runoff volume our proposed project will generate on an annualized basis. So once again, it's not too hard to figure out. We take our catchment. In this case, we're going to subtract our lake area from our catchment, and we're going to multiply that by our average rainfall, our 57 inches, our new runoff coefficient for the proposed condition of 0.322. Again, unit conversions to get us to acre feet per year. And we have established now in our proposed project condition, we're going to generate 29.718 acre feet per year of runoff. Now that we've established our runoff volume, we can multiply that volume by our EMCs for our proposed project and develop our proposed loading for those nitrogen and phosphorus. So as we scroll down here, I hopefully do this slowly. Here we go. And we can calculate our mass loading. Again, we're going to convert units from acre feet per year to the metric system because all of our results are going to be reported in kilograms per year. So we have our little unit conversion there to get that done. 1.233, we multiply by our annual runoff volume, we multiply by our EMC value, and we can come up with our total phosphorus mass loading at 11.98 and our total nitrogen loading of 64.56. So that's our first set of results. Let's highlight those because we're going to come back to that. Whoops, didn't mean to highlight all that. And let's just grab those two guys. Okay, so now we've got to figure out how much do we need to reduce our load? What is our water quality performance standard criterion? As just pointed out in the rule, we see that in section 8.3.4. And we have to, because we're in an impaired basin, we're discharging to an impairment. That impairment is also an OFW. That puts us in the 95% category. We still have to calculate the pre-post, and we still have to figure out which of the two calculations produces the most conservative load reduction requirement for either nitrogen or phosphorus. As just pointed out, it's not one set of calcs or the other. It's what is the condition that generates the most load reduction requirement for either constituent. So let's take a look, and we begin to calculate our percent load or pre-post load reduction, looking at our preload and our post load. We do the simple math of percent reduction, and we see that we need to get to, and I'm going to scroll up a little bit here. We're talking about phosphorus as our first constituent, pre over post times 100, 1 minus the standard expression. And we come up with 96.99% needed for phosphorus. A little note here, a key point here. Our rule said 95% was our threshold requirement, but what we've just discovered is our pre-post analysis indicates a higher value for phosphorus. So that becomes our criteria, not the 95%. So required load removal is just the math. The 97% or so times our load means we need to reduce our phosphorus by 11.623 kilograms per year. Moving on to nitrogen, again, the rule says 95% or pre-post. So let's do our pre-post calculation from our prior results. We have our load on pre and post condition. We plug it into the percent preload calculation. We come up with 68.33%. Okay, good news. The pre-post is not going to govern here. It's going to be the 95% because it is the higher of the two. So we're going to have a 97% load reduction requirement for phosphorus and the 95% for our nitrogen. And here we have it summarized here below in our table. Which constituent, what is the net improvement percent, what is the percent by rule, and what becomes the resulting requirement of the project. And as we said, they're not going to be one method or the other. It's going to be the greater of the either constituent in either method. All right, so let's take a look at a wet pond. Whoops, I'm a little too far ahead of ourselves. So a wet pond, just pointed out some key points about wet ponds. I'm going to retouch on some of those just to emphasize, but the volume of the wet pond and the removal efficiency is derived from the permanent pool volume and the annual residence time. And the annual residence time is derived from the permanent pool volume divided by the runoff volume of the project, and of course, the unit conversion of 365 days per year. And in this example, based on our pond, we end up with a annual residence time of 888 days. As we indicated, and as you will find in the appendix of Handbook 1, you will see that you can't use 888 days. You are limited to 200. And you'll find that in the appendix where it gives a good description of a wet detention pond. Now, I do want to pause here just briefly to give another key point, and I think I have a graphic on the next page that will help a little bit. All right, so Here we have the typical wet detention pond. You'll see this very same image in the appendix of Handbook 1, and below it you will find some narrative descriptions about the requirements of a wet detention pond and how the permanent pool volume is calculated. You'll also find that maximum of 200 days noted, and some maximum efficiencies will be listed as well. We're going to do the math here, but what I do want to point out here is, as Jess pointed out, when he did the parallels between the new rules and our Handbook 2, because the new rules are mostly in Handbook 1, and our Handbook 2 was revised as well, the requirement for a lake to be a half an acre in size carries over from our old Handbook 2 to our new Handbook 2. So while that is not listed in Appendix 1 under the description of wet detention, it is a requirement in our district that the wet pond still be a half an acre in size. All right, so the efficiency equation, which is listed at the top of the page for phosphorus and for nitrogen, those two equations can be found in Appendix O below the description of the image you see for how a wet pond, how efficient it is at removing. When we plug in our values for our project, our 200 days in this example, we come up with 79.87 as our removal efficiency for phosphorus, and we come up with our plug in similar values into the nitrogen expression, and we get 42.8%. Many of you will recognize those two values. You will see them again in Appendix O as pretty much your maximums for a wet pond's capabilities, which should, and I'd like to make a key point here. So what we've just discovered is that a wet pond's maximum nitrogen efficiency is just under 43%. So if your project had to meet only the minimum performance standard, it would be 80 and 55. So that should tell all of us that a wet pond on its own, all by itself, won't get you to 55. You're going to have to do more to get to that 55 minimum number. In our case, it's much higher, but even in other projects, a wet pond alone will not get you, no matter how big it is, to 55. You're going to have to do something more to it. And we're going to give you some tips and tricks on how to get there. And the first one we're going to talk about is littoral plantings. Now, just as our other prior handbook required littoral areas, a lot of folks don't remember that, but our prior handbook did require littoral areas. We didn't require you to plant them, but we did have them. And we still have them in Handbook 2. But we will give you up to 10% of a load reduction efficiency if you plant them. To do that, as Jess pointed out, you must plant at least 20% of the lake's area. And that's the area of the lake at its wet season water table elevation. In our case, we have 3.38 acres in our plan, and we multiply by 20%. And that says to me, I've got to produce 0.66 acres of planted littoral area in my project to get that 10% efficiency out of my project. Now, whoops, let me go back up one here. Sorry. I missed a little something. Maybe it's at the bottom. Well, it's not there, but so Jess mentioned, and I want to emphasize here as a key point, if you want to use this tool, you must provide a planting plan with your engineering plans. You must provide a operation and maintenance plan, how you're going to maintain that littoral zone. And one of the other key things is a removal of the mature biomass, which is the mechanism by which the nitrogen and phosphorus, which is bound in the biomass, is actually going to get removed. Because as we all understand, conservation of mass, if we never remove the vegetation, the nitrogen and phosphorus is just continuously recycled. So we've got to remove that mature vegetation to achieve this load reduction. And that needs to be part of your plan. Okay, so moving on to stormwater harvesting. So as Jess pointed out, stormwater harvesting is akin to, using water that's in your pond to irrigate your site with. There's a couple of specific things here and key points that I do want to point out. Okay, in order to use stormwater harvesting, you must retain a volume, partly to your discretion, but in your pond. So here in this example, when I use the word harvest volume of 2 acre-feet, that is a retained volume. That means my lowest discharge out of my wet pond must provide 2 acre-feet of storage between that discharge elevation and the water table of the pond. So that's a retained volume. We have an irrigated area, as Jess pointed out. Probably don't want to tell us you're irrigating the buildings. So we're talking about pervious areas, obviously, and an irrigation rate. Again, these are user-defined parameters that you're going to select based on your site plan and your project. Okay, and then the methodology of using stormwater harvesting looks at an annualized runoff volume and an annualized use rate, and all of that is based on a study that was done in 1991 by Dr. Juanalista and others that developed what we refer to as rate efficiency volume curves. And so they are a function, the efficiency of removal is a function of essentially the runoff volume or the harvest volume, and the harvest rate or the use rate, depending on which graphic you look at, to establish the efficiency of the stormwater harvesting BMP. Again, a key note here, as just pointed out, if you're going to use this BMP in your design, your project must have a consumptive use annual allocation that at least meets the harvest volume that you've established in your design and or greater. And those two applications will need to run concurrently. So please submit your irrigation applications along with your ERPs if you want to get through the process more efficiently. So when we do the math on this methodology, we can calculate, and it's all the best way I can explain it is similar to a unit rate hydrograph. It's all normalized to an equivalent impervious area. So to do the math here, we've got to determine what that is. And in this example, I used our 22.73 acre project. I subtracted out our lake and our retention pond. And I also used a conservative runoff coefficient of 0.8 and came up with a 3.56 acres of our equivalent impervious area. Again, this is just for example purposes. And so we go and we take that and we can calculate our harvest or I'm sorry, our runoff volume, which is our harvest volume divided by our equivalent impervious area. So we take and we plug the values in, our equivalent impervious area over our harvest volume, do a unit conversion to get it into inches, and we end up with 1.77 inches, which is on our little chart here of the REB curves. That is our x-axis value. And then for our y-axis value, we're looking for that use rate, or sometimes referred to as a harvest rate, which is our irrigation rate times our irrigated area, again, divided or normalized by our equivalent impervious area. We plugged our numbers in from our design, 1 inch per week, 9.3 acres, our EIA of 13.5 acres, conversion for weeks and days, and we get 0.098 inches per day per EIA, and that's our y-axis over here, and we come to our little red triangle here, and we fall on, and these are a series of curves that are developed for each hydrological zone. So just like you went to the zone maps to determine your runoff coefficients, there are zone maps for the removal efficiency rates around the state for stormwater harvesting. So when we plug in our two parameters, we come up and we see we're just around the 60% removal efficiency curve. And when we number crunch real close, it's just about 61%. So now we've determined our removal efficiency rate for our stormwater harvesting BMP. So let's take a look at our next step. And now we need to calculate our required BMP, because at this point, we have not achieved the level that we need to. So we can take a look at the standard treatment efficiency equation, which can be found in ERP Applicant Handbook Volume 1, equation 9.5, which is the total treatment is a function of the efficiency of each of the BMPs in series. And so we can solve the equation for our efficiency number 2 that we're trying to target. and we put in our total treatment volume. In this case, we're going to calculate phosphorus first. And so we determined earlier we got to get to 0.9699, and we put in our efficiencies for our other BMPs, EF1, EF2, and EF3, the last one we just calculated, and we figure out our total removal efficiency for phosphorus is now 57.39%. Do similar math for nitrogen, and we come up with 75.09%. So now we know, okay, that's how much treatment efficiency I need to establish a retention depth. I got to get there. So if I go back to Appendix O in the Applicant's Handbook, Volume 1, and we look at the various tables are in depths of rainfall. So they're in quarter-inch increments, so quarter, half, three-quarter inch. We look at the three-quarter inch table for a retention depth. To get us above 75, we find that 3/4 of an inch, given our parameters, will get us to 79%. So now we've established all of our load reductions. We can calculate our total loads for this project design, plugging in all the efficiencies into the efficiency equation for our various BMPs in series, plugging them all in, calculating that all the way out. We get to a load reduction of 98.52% for phosphorus, and we get to a load reduction for nitrogen of 96.84%. From those percentages, we can calculate our actual mass of reduction of 0.177 kilograms, and we can calculate the 2.04 kilograms per year for nitrogen that we're going to need to remove. Okay, so let's go on to the next step. And here we are. So we're all done. We've got all of our math done. And what we've got here is an example of the data set of your results that we are going to be entering into our staff reports. So we need you folks to prepare a summary table that looks much like this one, that identifies for both phosphorus and for nitrogen the pre-development annual mass loading, so what you first calculated, your post-development mass loading without your BMPs, your required reduction, whichever rule governs. So in this case, we found out that it's going to be 95 for nitrogen, but the pre-post gave us 96.99, so that's the one that governs. A required removal of the actual mass, so we just do the math, and we come up with our removal. Our target discharge load, when we do that removal, those are our actual discharge loads in kilograms per year. And then our provided reduction of our actual design was a little bit above the requirement of 97, almost 98.5 in this case, and just over the requirement of 96.8. And then again, the proposed development discharge load, we calculate that out. It's a simple math, simple multiplication. And we again calculate the total amount of nitrogen and phosphorus removed via our project. So this type of a data table is what we're going to be looking for to put that same data into the staff reports for these future projects. All right, so let's see here. All right. Again, I think I touched on much of this, these next couple slides during the presentation, but we'll just go over them a little bit. So littoral plantings, like we said, got to have that 20% of the lake area, monitoring and maintenance plan, obviously cross sections to show those littoral zones that meet the criteria, plan view of littoral shelves with the planting plans, and again, no less than 20% of the lake area. Again, some of the key points about stormwater harvesting. We talked a little bit about it's a retention volume that's going to be in the wet system that you're going to be drawing down via irrigation. It's a function of the permanent pool volume and the residence time. I'm sorry, for stormwater harvesting, it's a function of those removal efficiency curves. But you need to have a water use permit that at least matches the amount of water you're going to irrigate with and or greater. Likely it will be greater, but be sure that you're demonstrating that and submitting your water use applications. And then again, another rehash of the key points about retention. Retention volumes used to meet load reductions need to recover in 72 hours, which means you're going to need to do some form of an infiltration analysis. Has to be site specific. You should be considering groundwater mounding if your project has a very shallow water table, and it should include a safety factor of 2. Depending on the methodology that you choose, and there are many, you'll need to provide the supporting tabulations that you have developed for those input parameters. If you're using some of the ones that use the green amp methodology, you should be providing a map of those infiltrated boundaries to make sure they don't overlap with a canal, a pond, or each other in your project design. So I think that's the end of my first example. Let me just take a look here. Oh, so some more references, just so you can see kind of what these things look like. I was going to try to use a live link on the GIS tool on the DEP's Water Resources website. However, given the warnings of internet functionality, I thought that was a bad idea. But this is what it will look like. So you'll see the patchwork of colors. Those colors represent various waters not attaining standards. The little red lines represent the HUC 12 boundaries. I realize you probably can't see that real well at this scale, but that's what that map will give you. And you can, as a base map, but you can also add to it layers. It's a GIS tool. And many of you are GIS experts. You could build your own GIS tool. But that's essentially what the DEP put together to help us quickly ascertain what HUC 12 we're in and what impairments may exist. And you can add the OFW information. And so one of the key things I did want to point out, like I said, I didn't do it in the live because I didn't think it would work. But when you click on this tool, when you click on the HUC or the project location of your project, you will notice there is a first dialog box. That is most likely one of many. So in this example, I'm not sure how well you guys can see this, but I'm going to zoom in just for illustration. There are 10. There are 10 items here, so you need to scroll through them when you're using this tool, and it will give you the first few things it will give you are the various impairments. Now, in my example, the first 7 or 8 of those are the various impairments. So total nitrogen, total phosphorus, dissolved oxygen, bacteria, chlorophyll A, mercury, copper, and then there's an adopted TMDL that's also present, and the HUC 12. Okay, so you'll get all of those pieces of data, but you must scroll using these back and forth arrows to get to those various lists of what that layer represents or layers represent. So in this case, you can see this one's sitting on the HUC 12 data set or feature, but there are 9 others associated with this location using this DEP tool. And I think I got a couple more slides. I'm not going to dive too deep into the flow chart, but in essence, this flow chart will help you if you have trouble determining what your criteria is. It's out there on the DEP website under the Water Resources Center page where you can kind of figure out what's applicable to your project. It's like all flow charts, you're going to start over here in the pre-development condition, talk about your project, and it'll bring you around to doing a pre-post, and then you kind of pause until you come back up here and you say, is this project redevelopment? No. So then you come into the next box and you say, what's the HUC 12? Okay, we look that up. Is the HUC 12, do we have an impairment? Yes or no? So we go further down in the flow chart. Yes, we have an impairment. And then do we need to meet the requirement for an OFW? Yes, we do, because we have an impairment and an OFW. And it gets us down to the bottom of the flow chart where it says, okay, we got to get to 95%. And then the 2 flow charts converge, and you got to determine which one of the 2, as we showed in this example, is actually the governing criteria for both nitrogen and phosphorus. So I think I got a couple more slides here. And this one, yeah, so I just showed this earlier. This is the Appendix M rainfall map and the isopleth map. Again, you saw those earlier. Those are in the appendix. Again, table 9.2. Can't stress enough how important it is that you guys are all looking at this and not relying upon prior data sets you may have acquired over the last 10 or 15 years. Be sure to be using 9.2. This is the Appendix N that I made reference to during the presentation when I'm calculating the runoff coefficient as the heading. and along the top, which is the x-axis and the y-axis of non-DCIA curve numbers lined up with your percentage of DCIA. You use these various tables depending on your meteorological zone to establish what your annual runoff coefficient is, both in the pre-case and in your proposed project case. And so these are where that data set, where those coefficients come from. And they're all there in Appendix N of Applicant's Handbook Volume 1. And with that, I think we're done. Yep, we've made it to the end of our first example of single family. And so with that, I'm going to take a breath and wet my whistle for a second, so bear with me, and then we'll roll into an example of a commercial site plan. So one moment, please. Okay, so same disclaimer as before, ladies and gentlemen. These examples today are just for reference only. They're illustrative in nature. They're not a specific project. They're not the only way to do this. They are just examples to help you understand how to apply these new performance standards to a specific project type. And we've kind of mixed in some different BMPs just to help you guys see how they might be used to meet this new criteria. So with that, let's get into it. So some of you may recognize this picture. I do, from our really old handbook, volume 4 back in the day, and it's moved forward into our guidance document, but it's a basic commercial site plan. Nothing too exciting. I'm going to zoom out a little bit so we can see everything. But we have a 50-acre, commercial site plan. In this particular example, we're going to look at the location being in Collier County, and we're going to use a lake, a wet detention pond. And because it's commercial, we're going to go ahead and do our 20% requirement using exfiltration trench, everybody's favorite BMP. So let's get into the math. Okay, hopefully, oops, there we go. All right, so got to run through our project characteristics again, similarly as we did before. So we have a low intensity commercial. Again, that's important. What type of commercial we have or industrial. Again, going back to table 9.2 handbook 1. Our location, we've looked up our HUC 12 using the GIS tool on DEP's website. And we've figured out by using that tool that, hey, no impairment in the basin. We've got our water body ID, no impairment. No impairment downstream? Do we have an OFW downstream? No. So, okay, good news so far. What's our project design land use? We've got 50-acre project. We've got about 36 acres of impervious. Good amount of that is roof, probably industrial warehouse, some roads and parking. We're going to build a lake. We've got some pervious areas, and we've established our water table and our receiving water condition. So let's take a look at calculating our treatment efficiencies and our water quality criteria. So we go back to the rule. Always got to go to the rule. Section 8.3.2, Handbook 1. What do I got to do? Well, for my site, I have to meet the minimum standard of 80 and 55. Remember, we talked about that before. Wet pond won't get you there. But we also have to do a pre-post. So we're going to do both, and we're going to walk through and see how we can make this project meet that criteria. So, but we're commercial. So we've got to add another element here. We've got to meet the criteria of subsection 4.1.1, where we have to provide 20% of that load reduction in a retention BMP. And hopefully most all of you know exfiltration trench is a retention BMP, and it's what we're going to use. So let's get into that. Okay, so first got to figure out how much runoff are we going to generate here in pre and post. So we go to our Appendix M, we pull up our map, we figure out we're in zone 4, and then we figure out what our average annual rainfall depth is. And for our location, it's 54 inches per year. We take a quick look at our existing conditions. So in this case, our existing site is pasture. And so another point, I want to pause and kind of talk about a key point here, and that is correctly identifying an existing condition at a site. I know Jess touched on it briefly, but we see it often where the engineer or the designer doesn't quite understand what those things in table 9.2 really mean. And so you need to understand what those things are. What is xeric scrub? What is flatwoods? What is upland hardwood? What is ruderal upland pine? What are these things? What do they look like? And you may need to, and I often do, solicit the assistance of a naturalist or a biologist who knows what wet flatwoods are supposed to look like, right? So always have that in your mind. Understand ruderal upland pine, what the word ruderal means. It means disturbed, right? So all of these things we need to have a good handle on what they actually look like, and does our project match that? Sometimes there's some challenges, and if you get stuck, reach out to us and we'll help you establish what the appropriate description of your site condition is based on what it is today, not what it was 20 years ago when citrus canker wiped out the citrus grove. Okay, so moving on. Pre-development condition here actually is pasture. We've confirmed, yep, there's moo cows walking around. Yep, they're using it for a calf cow operation, so it's definitely pasture is the right existing use. So we pull off of table 9.2 our EMC values. We take a look at our soil conditions on the site and establish some runoff curve numbers. We've got CD soils, and we don't have any impervious area under the existing condition. It is strictly 100% pervious. So when we go through the math again to calculate our DCIA, well, 0 divided by 50 is still 0. So our percent DCIA is 0. So then we look at our non-DCIA curve number and we say, okay, well, once again, we don't have any impervious, but once we plug the numbers into the expression, 0 from 0 times 98 is still 0, and 0 from 0 is still 0 times 50, or plus 50 is 50, and so we still end up back at 89, which is okay. That's what we expect, right? So then we take our percentage of DCIA, which is 0, and our non-DCI curve number, which we've established as 89, and we go to those tables in Appendix N of Handbook 1, and we look up what is our runoff coefficient, and there it is. At the bottom of my page here, I'm going to highlight it because that's an important number. Whoops, I'm going to try and highlight it. There we go. So 0.249, that is our runoff, our annual runoff coefficient for this existing pasture in Collier County. So next steps, let's move on. We can get this thing to move. Here we go. So now that we have that runoff coefficient, let's calculate our runoff volume, our annualized runoff volume, taking our 50-acre catchment, our 54 inches per year of rainfall, our runoff coefficient that we just calculated, and we put in the unit conversions, and we come up with 56.02 acre feet per year is our runoff volume for the existing condition. Now we're going to take a look at what is our actual mass loading. Same as before, we have simply multiplying that runoff volume times that EMC. Of course, we have all of these fun unit conversions to get from the English system to the metric system. We all learned about that in college. So we're going to crunch in all of our kilograms and milligrams and milligrams and liters and acre feet and acres and gallons and cubic feet and all that fun stuff. And we come in and we do the math and we put in our EMC, we put in our runoff volume, we put in our unit conversion, and we come up with what our load reduction, what our load is for phosphorus, and that's our 40.94 kilograms, just as we did before. And we'll do the same thing for nitrogen, again, using the nitrogen EMC along with those other parameters, and we come up with 209. Whoops, my little cursor thing ain't working so good. But 209 is our number for total nitrogen mass loading of the existing condition and 40.94 kilograms per year of phosphorus. So now let's look at our post loading. So in our post condition, we've established that our project meets the description of low intensity commercial. Again, I can't stress enough how important it is to select the correct EMC based on your project type, your conditions, and that you understand what each one of these things should look like and how it matches your site plan or your project or your location. So we pull off of table 9.2 our EMCs for phosphorus and nitrogen. There they are 0.190 for phosphorus and 0.93 milligrams per liter for nitrogen. Taking a look at our site soil conditions, we got good hydrologic conditions. We have a type C soil. We got about 36 acres of impervious area, which we would use a curve number of about 98. And then we can calculate our directly connected impervious area from our site plan and come up with our 28.8 acres of DCIA. Moving into the next step, we got to figure out our percentage of DCIA. So we take our DCIA, divide it by our total site plan, like Jess mentioned before, and we figure out that that's 57.6% of directly connected impervious area percentage. And then again, we take a look at our pervious area. We look at our pervious curve number. We calculate our non-directly connected impervious area curve number. We plug in our 74. We do the math times our impervious and impervious areas for the standard equation, and we come up with a non-DCIA curve number of 87.09. So we need these two numbers. We need that percent DCIA and our non-DCIA curve number. Those are the two numbers we need. We can't lose track of that, because we're going to take those two numbers. We're going to go to Appendix N of Applicant's Handbook Volume 1. We're going to look up in the table, based on those two parameters, what our runoff coefficient, our annual runoff coefficient is. And when we do that, we get 0.566. So now we can take that runoff coefficient and calculate our annual runoff volume as we did before. Difference is different catchment area, different rainfall amount, and a different coefficient, right? But same unit conversions for feet and inches and all that fun stuff. And we come up with 127.35 acre feet of runoff volume on an annualized basis in acre feet per year. So now we want to once again determine our annual mass load of our proposed project and simultaneously convert that number into metric and using the units of kilogram per year. So we've got our unit conversion as we used before, for all that milligrams per liter, gallons, and all that fun stuff is 1.233. And our 127.35 acre feet per year we just calculated, and our EMC value that we already determined, and for phosphorus and nitrogen, and we pull those together and we do the math, and we come up with a total phosphorus annual mass load of 29.8 kilograms per year. Do the same for nitrogen. Again, our 157 value as our unit conversion and all that times our basin, or I'm sorry, our EMC gets us to our 146.031 kilograms per year of nitrogen loading. So now we've established our total phosphorus load and our total nitrogen load of our project, and we've already determined what the preloads are. So we can now begin to assess what is our requirement, given we now know these things. So back to the rule book, back to Handbook 1, back to Section 8.3, and we see, oh yeah, we already figured this out. We have to get to 80%, that's our minimum standard, or pre versus post in this case. So we do our pre-post, pre divided by post, 1 minus times 100. We calculate that for both nitrogen and for phosphorus, and we can come up with our load reduction requirement of, but this case, the number is negative 37.31%. Well, that should tell us right off the bat that the pre is much higher than the post. So the pre-post is not going to govern here, because the math says we're in good shape on the pre-post side of things. Let's look at the next page, and let's look at the requirement continue to look at the requirement for phosphorus. We look at our required load reduction using the 80% requirement. So we looked at our load, we reduce it by 80%, and we come up with 23.867 kilograms per year. And we're going to do some of this as dry. So we're going to go ahead and calculate what that is. Now, I've got dry retention listed here, but it's a dry retention BMP. Exfiltration trench is a dry retention BMP. So we're going to calculate our 23.867 that we've got to reduce it by, and 20% of that we got to do as a dry retention BMP. So now we've established we've got to do 4.7. We've got to remove 4.77 kilograms per year in our design for phosphorus. Now let's look at nitrogen. So we said back to the rule book, handbook 1, 8.32, 55%. Talked about that early on. Pre-post, got to do that too. Again, plug in the values pre and post. Once again, we get a negative number, right? Because we're going from a very high preload to a high post load, but it's actually lower because of the land use change and in combination with the runoff change. And that's a key point. While it shows up here in the math, but for everyone's benefit, if you understand this methodology, the drivers in the loading is a function of the change in EMC and the change in runoff, right, on an annualized basis. So, all right, so we do our required load removal. We take our 146 kilograms per year, and we got to reduce that by 55%. That's what the rule says. The pre-post is not going to govern here, but the minimum standard is. So we got to get to 80.37 kilograms per year of reduction in load for nitrogen. We got to get rid of that much nitrogen. And 20% of that, like we said before, because this is commercial, we've got to get 20% of that in a dry retention BMP. So let's go ahead and calculate what that needs to be. And we've come up with our 20% as 16.06 kilograms per year as our required retention BMP. So to summarize, what's our requirement? We did our pre-post net improvement calcs and realized they're both negative values, so that's not going to govern our design. The minimum standards in the rule is 80 and 55. That's what's going to govern. And so our requirement is the 80 and the 55. So that's what we got to do with our project. So now let's take a look at what we can achieve with the BMPs that we have chosen in our site plan. So the first one being the wet pond. We have our 8 acres of lake, and we've done some math with a CAD program or average end area method, what have you. We've established the stage storage characteristics of the pond, as Jess pointed out, and as is indicated in the appendix of Handbook 1, it is the full volume of the pond from the bottom to the water table, whatever that is. In our area, those volumes tend to get bigger because our rule in Handbook 2, Section 5, does not limit you to how deep you can go, and so people can dig 20-foot deep ponds, no problem. So we get big volumes. However, as we also pointed out and is identified again in Handbook 1, you can only max out at 200 days of residence time. So when you calculate that volume divided by your annual runoff, so your permanent pool volume divided by your runoff volume, unit conversion from days to year, you come up with days, right? So, but we're going to limit you to 200. Even though you calculated out your pond will yield 247, you're still limited to 200. Okay? And we know from, again, looking at the appendix under wet detention, and we know from experience that that's only going to give us so much treatment, right? So much reduction. So here we go. We revisit the back of the Appendix O of Handbook 1. This is the graphic, but there's a lot of description that's also included below it. There's the expression for the efficiency of a wet pond for phosphorus. Below it is the expression for the removal efficiency for nitrogen. There's all kinds of fun math here, natural logs, but our 200 day is the important number here. That's the variable you're plugging in, is that 200 days. And so we plug that in and we get 79.87%, no surprise. That's exactly what the maximum is. And do similar math for the nitrogen, and once again, no surprise, we're at the 42.8 for what that pond can achieve, right? Because it's a big pond. So there we go. We've got our removal efficiency for our first BMP established at 79.87 and 42.81% respectively for phosphorus and nitrogen. So let's move on to our next BMP. Okay. And how are we going to figure out how much we need? So we can go back and we can look at our treatment efficiency equation for BMPs in series. This is provided in Applicant's Handbook, Volume 1, Equation 9-5. Similarly, as I said, much of this methodology is also found in the 2007 FDEP report, same equations, same information. And so we can rearrange this expression to determine what our efficiency of our second BMP needs to be. And so we can calculate that, rearranging the expression. We have efficiency 2 equals to 1 minus our total amount of treatment over efficiency 1. And so we plug in that in for phosphorus and nitrogen, and we can calculate our two loads. 80 and 55% is where we're trying to get to, and our available load reductions for our BMP. And we come up with 0.65% for phosphorus and 21.31% for nitrogen. I think that's a little typo there. That's total nitrogen on the second one. Okay, so that tells us how much load reduction we need to have or can get and need to get in their retention BMP. So when we go back and look at our tables in Appendix O of Handbook 1, looking at our project parameters and our meteorological zone, we can figure out that, hey, given my percent DCIA and my curve number for non-DCIA and a depth of 1/4 of an inch, I can get a 32% load reduction if I retain 0.25 inches in my system. And that exceeds what I need. I need to get to 21. 32 will get me there. 1/4 inch is the lowest table, so I'm there. 1/4 inch will get it done. All right, so now let's look at trench, our favorite BMP. Okay, so as Jess pointed out, these expressions are in our handbooks, have been in them for decades. They can be rearranged to solve for volume or length or whatever your desires are, but the fundamental expression includes a hydraulic conductivity, as many of you probably know. It has to be site-specific. You cannot pull this number out of a engineering index. It must be from your site, from the geotechnical report. Again, seasonal high water table is imperative. You have to have H2 has to be the retained elevation on the system. There has to be a weir in the system to establish that retained volume. Hence, it is a retention BMP. And of course, the width of our trench and the proper expression based on the ratios of lengths and widths and all of that fun stuff. We go through the steps and we plug in all the various parameters into our expression, and we can, including our safety factor, and we can calculate the length of trench that will produce a particular volume as our input, right? And so in our design, we're trying to get to that 1/4 inch times 50 acres, which is 12.50 acre inches, right? So that's our lowest level of retention that we're trying to achieve. And so that's our magic number that we calculated, right? 12.5 acre inches. Plug it into the expression and let's calculate our length, right? So everyone knows and should be familiar with our expression, but there it is. You can find it in Handbook 2. And we calculate for length. In this instance, we put our volume in the numerator. Volume of water quality is our 12.5 acre inches, and we come up with a trench given those dimensional information, water table, and all that. And we come up with 1,044.3 feet of trench. We'll call it 1,045. And that will give us the amount of retention to meet the load reduction requirement of the 20% as part of our load reduction for our overall project. So now we can take a look at where we stand. And once again, we go back to the efficiency equation for BMPs in series, equation 9.5 of Handbook 1. And we plug in all of our efficiencies that we've just calculated in our expression. And we come up with, for phosphorus, an 86.37% load reduction. And lo and behold, we need to get to 80, so we got there. So we calculate that out to what that actually represents. We take our load and our efficiency, and we come up with 44.66 kilograms per year. We take a look at our BMP for retention, our 20%. We're using the trench. We take our load, multiply by our efficiencies, and we come up with our load per year of 9.63 kilograms per year. We did the same thing for nitrogen. And we can again use the efficiency equation, come up with 61.28%. Again, that's greater than the 55. So we know we're in the good. Then we can calculate our actual loads and our actual discharge loads by simply doing the math with our efficiencies and our actual loads. And we can come up with our total nitrogen of 56.54 and our total dry retention removal of 47.15. And so we're building our data table by doing the math on what we're actually going to get out of our design. And here we are. Boom. We have established all of the parameters to demonstrate that we meet criteria. We're going to put them all on this really nice summary table. So the staff at the district can easily take this information and transcribe it directly into the staff report. So we're going to run through everything for phosphorus and nitrogen, the pre-development mass load. For nitrogen and phosphorus, those are our numbers we calculated early on. Our post-development annual loads without our BMPs, again, we calculated those. We figured out the pre-post is not going to govern here. It's the main rule that's going to cover. So we got our 80 and 55%. That's our requirement. Here's the actual removal based on that requirement. We just did the math. Removal requirement and dry retention, we said that was 20%. We just got done calculating that at 4.7 and 16, roughly kilograms per year for phosphorus and nitrogen respectively. And then the removal by dry retention resulting is 9.63 and 47. And our target discharge load is the load coming out the end of the pipe. Again, we'll do the math with our efficiencies at the end and come up with our 5.9 and 65% kilograms per year is what's actually being discharged from the project system. Total provided reduction, again, that's just a standard reduction calculation, percent load reductions. And you see we're clearly exceeding the requirement of 80 and 55. We're at 86 and 61. So we've met the minimum standard. And then we can also calculate our actual post-load discharges of those constituents for nitrogen and both phosphorus. And we can also calculate the total amount removed of both phosphorus and nitrogen. So it's a lot of number crunching, I know, but it's all basic math, multiplication and division. The key factors here is getting the right data, the right EMC, then thus getting the right DCIA, getting the right runoff coefficients, so that the rest of this all falls into place. So let's see what else we got here. I think I got a couple more slides for you guys. So let's take a look. So again, I think we touched on this in the prior example, but I'll retouch on it here because it is important. We need to make sure that our retained systems are going to recover in 72 hours, whatever that retained volume is being used to meet these new performance standards. Obviously, if you're having to perk it into the ground, you're not discharging it because it's retention. You're going to have to do some form of an infiltration analysis. And you're going to have to support that analysis with on-site data. And if you have a shallow water table, you should be considering or modifying your modeling to reflect the potential for groundwater mounding. And as always, in the old handbook and in the new one, we got to have that safety factor of 2 for any infiltration analysis. Moving on, again, another example. This one is specific, but it's the same kind of thing I was trying to show you guys earlier. I will zoom in again so you can kind of see. But this is specific to this example over in Collier County, using the DEP's tool for HUC 12s and waters not achieving standards. And in this case, we have the OFW layer turned on, although there isn't one identified on the map. You would see these blue colors if it were. And so, again, that's a layer you must turn on. When you first use this tool, that layer is not turned on. You'll need to add it. But you'll also see in this example, I don't see more than one feature. So that's actually good because that means there's no impairments, there's no TMDL, and there's no OFW, right? So it's just going to give us the HUC 12 number. That's all this one will give us given our location, which is why the rule is what it is for this particular project. Okay, let's see what else I got here. I think I got a few more slides for you guys. Again, this is just a walkthrough of how this project could have looked at the flow chart if you want to use that as your tool to assess, which is the criteria that your project must meet. But Same starting points. Is the project for redevelopment? Yes or no? No. What's your HUC 12? Is it impaired? No. Determine the nitrogen and phosphorus loads. That's all fine. Do you discharge to an OFW? No. And so 55% nitrogen, 80% phosphorus, that's your criteria. And then, of course, you got to do the starting point on the other side. You got to do your pre-post. You compare the two, and that becomes your final determination as to your requirement. Once again, another peek at these maps, which again were originally published in 2007 in the DEP report for the state of Florida when this methodology was first created. But there they are. They're also in Appendix M of Handbook 1 for your viewing pleasure. The other thing, in case you're not are geographically challenged, sometimes I am, when you see this in the appendix, below this image is a list of the counties by zone. So if you're not good with colors or you're colorblind and blue grains don't work for you, you can simply read the list and it'll tell you, if you're in Collier County, well, you're in zone 4 or whatever your zone is. There's a table of the county and the zone corresponding. So to help you folks that are colorblind. And then again, the isoplastic map of the whole state with these annual rainfall amounts, again, recently published in 2007, provided for your use in Handbook 1. And then I can't emphasize enough how important this table is in understanding what those various names mean. What is a dry prairie? What is mesic flatwoods? What are scrubby flatwoods? Needing to understand what these things are and how your project matches these things, low intensity or high intensity, single family, multifamily, etc. Xeric scrub, wet prairie, all of these things. Rangeland, parkland. I do want to touch on that one briefly because oftentimes we have sites, for example, that may have been cleared and filled 20 years ago. Citrus Grove was plowed under 20 years ago, and now it's just a big giant grass field. They never decided to use it for necessarily pasture or any other use. It's just a big, big giant field. Well, that's essentially rangeland parkland is the best fit for something like that. So again, get familiar with these various land use category descriptors and understand how they apply or don't apply to your project, and make sure you're using the values that are in this table for your project tabulations. And I got to be getting close to the end. Okay, once again, in Appendix N, you're going to find these runoff coefficient tables based on the zone that you're in, and they are a function of your non-DCIA curve numbers and your DCI percentage that you calculate up front. And it's in these tables that you will find your runoff coefficient to begin to calculate, again, your annual amount of runoff. And last but not least, whoops, hey, here we are. We're at the end. Thank you for bearing with me, everyone. And I will turn this back over to Jess and Melissa and let them begin to assist with any questions. So thank you for your time today. Hopefully you learned something.
Thanks, Glenn. All right, so we're going to begin our question and answer period now. So anyone who has a question, we are going to start taking questions. So if you're on Zoom, you can use the raise hand feature in Zoom. If you're on the phone, you can. Ooh.
Oh, sorry, Melissa. I can leave it on my screen if you want.
Yeah, that would be great, Glenn. Thanks. If not, I
Sure,
can share it on mine.
I can do that. No worries. Sorry about that. Didn't mean to upset the apple cart. Let's see if oh, share. There we go. All
Thanks,
right, should be
Glenn.
back on my screen.
All right, if you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. And if you're on the phone, *6 mutes and unmutes you. We did also create an email address. So if we don't get to you today for questions, you can always email questions to us. I will warn you that if you do email questions, you may have a delayed response, as answering the questions could take a little bit of time. So starting with the people who've raising their hands, we're going to start with Lori first, followed by Rocio. So Lori, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay. Actually, I got a couple of quick questions. One is those examples that he gave, are those available to us? The examples
Yes, the presentation and the examples will be sent out after we conclude today's presentation. So those will be available to everyone who attended.
And then the other question that I had to do with stormwater harvesting and having to set your, I guess what would be probably your bleeder then would actually go up at the level where you want your volume for your irrigation. And I guess I'm just seeing that certainly that would then impact your 25 years to peak stages and potentially your 100-year peak stages also. Is that correct in terms of, there's a downside there to I guess using stormwater harvesting to what your peak to what your peak stages are going to be.
That's correct, Lori.
Okay. So, is there any way to sort of balance that out or not?
That'll be part of the design iterations that you all have to go through and making sure that there's adequate flood control as well as appropriate water quality treatment.
Okay. All right. I think that kind of covers what I wanted to ask about. Thank you.
All right, next up, we have Rocio followed by John. Rocio, you can unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Perfect. I have a couple of questions. The first one is, in the second example that we saw, you determined that the exfiltration trench is going to be 20%. Why 20%? Is something for the example, or is it a rule or something?
So, yes, if you recall, and you can revisit this, but in the handbook 1, it indicates by rule that if your site is commercial in nature, that 20% of your load reduction must be provided in a retention BMP. In this example, we chose exfiltration, but you could have used a dry retention pond.
Got it. I'm here located in the Miami area. Most of the projects that we do, we utilize French drain. So I'm guessing that we need to provide, they are a self-contained system. We don't have alpha or anything like that. We need to do all these calculations, right?
Yes, you do have the option of demonstrating that your project does not discharge at any time during the year based on the rainfall data that was used to develop those isopleths. So you have some prerogative as the designer. It is just the type of analysis you choose to provide to us.
Okay, what about if I have to submit a class 5 drainage well permit? I need to demonstrate all of this as well, right?
Yes.
Great, thank you.
All right, next up we have John, and just to be clear, it's John Porter, and that'll be followed by Jeffrey.
Hello, first of all, thank you for preparing the presentation and informing us. In the context of a wet detention pond, can you please explain how an engineer should determine the minimum allowable elevation for the first overflow weir above the bleed down device? And do we need to calculate a mixing volume to determine that?
That depends on what you're going to use the wet detention pond for as it relates to water quality. If you are only going to use the pond, the permanent pool volume portion of the pond, you can put that bleeder at the seasonal high water table. The sizing of it will be based on really the same criteria that we had in the previous rules. It's just been expressed differently. So before, that orifice could only discharge a ½ inch over the site in 24 hours. We've now, at an attempt in clarity, tried to, or rewritten that to be 13.5 CFS per square mile. Same basic premise. So you'll need to have whatever volume above the orifice that will create that initial limit and discharge rate.
So is there I guess a volume, would that be equal to ½ inch over the basin area of where we could have our next weir above that bleeder? Like if we were
Yes.
looking to set that elevation for attenuation?
That would suffice, yes.
And is that the expectation, to provide a ½ inch over the basin area as that volume?
No, there is no expectation. There is just what you all need to do to accomplish to meet the rules. So a ½ inch over the basin to set that elevation would be one way to do it, to set your driving head on that weir and then sizing it based on the allowable discharge rate through it. So I do foresee that being the most common way, but you all have latitude as the design professional.
Okay, thank you.
All right, next up we have Jeffrey, followed by Mark.
Hey, y'all. First of all, thanks very much for the presentation. It was a lot of detail there, Jess and Glenn. Thank y'all both. A couple of questions on recovery analysis. What is the procedure you're looking for demonstrating recovery in a retention exfiltration trench scenario?
So there's no prescribed method. I think Glenn touched on a few as he walked through the design examples. I know there are certain commercially available software packages that do groundwater mounding analysis and recovery and things like that. So what we're looking for is an analysis that takes into account the ability of water to percolate into the ground and a demonstration that volume needed to be retained for the purpose of water quality can move into the soil within 3 days.
And that's in a surface storage scenario or an exfiltration scenario?
In the exfiltration scenario, if the volume of exfiltration is below 3.28 inches over the site, there is a built-in presumption, if you will, that trench will recover within 1 hour. So that is kind of a self-evident process in that case. If you are choosing, and I'll kind of call out our contingent from Broward and Miami-Dade County in particular, if you are choosing to use exfiltration trench as a flood control device and attenuate greater than 3.28 inches, you will need to demonstrate that you can recover the system. The exfiltration trench equation was designed primarily for a 5-year, 1-hour storm event. So anything in excess of that needs to have additional reasonable assurance that the capacity will be recovered.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. And then just a couple of follow-ups on the recovery analysis. And you guys know where I am and the kind of water tables we have to deal with. So this is probably the most concerning part of all of this out here in Okeechobee world. I'm assuming the 72-hour clock starts on the receding leg of your hydrograph when you get back to your weir elevation, correct?
Yes.
And is it full recovery to 3 decimal places, or is it within 1/10 or within 100th, or because the way some of those models work, they kind of tail out into infinity at very, very small increments without quite getting back to level 0.
So we don't have a set tolerance, but I think a 1/10 is certainly the order of magnitude we'd be looking at. We would not be looking at the 100th or 1,000th as evidence of recovery. And Jeff, I do want to kind of clarify in the way that you phrased the question, looking at the total storm hydrograph and looking at the end of the storm, that is certainly one way. The other way to look at this is a slug load kind of analysis, where you simply start your pond off at that elevation where the water quality volume is achieved and then show that it recovers in 3 days.
Gotcha. And just do that as a separate model in whatever software we're using to look at that.
Correct.
Okay. And then last question on recovery, if it's a wet retention recovery scenario, will the district allow us to factor in ET over that period into that analysis?
Yes, the ET rates that we have had in the rule since I think the dawn of time are still there. So we do prescribe a rate of ET based on extinction depth, I believe. And you are more than welcome to account for that in any kind of analysis.
Great. That answers my questions, y'all. Thank you very much.
All right, next up we have Mark Wiley, followed by Mike.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So just to confirm, for wet detention, we can claim a permanent pool volume that corresponds to 200-day residence time, and the depth is not a factor in this case.
But we do want to see the math behind the permanent pool volume. So Glenn mentioned a stage storage curve, and maybe it's more appropriately called a stage volume at that point. But regardless, we would like to see the geometry and make sure that indeed there's 200 days worth of storage in that permanent pool volume. So the depth makes a difference from that standpoint, but we do not have a minimum or maximum depth limitation when it comes to the design of wet detention. You can make it as deep as you want.
Okay.
But what
And
we will be looking for, I'm sorry, what we will be looking for is on the construction plans, you need to extend the cross section of your lake now all the way down to the bottom. And call out what the area of the bottom is going to be, what the side slopes are going to be, keeping within our minimum slide slope requirements of 2 to 1 from 2 feet below control down, and 4 to 1 from 2 feet below control back up to top of bank.
okay. And just one more question, kind of going along with this, is if you have wet detention in series, the 200 days, does that have to be spread out over all of them, or can you claim 200 days for each one?
If you're interconnecting the ponds below the control elevation, if they all share the same control elevation, they're effectively one big pond. So at that point in time, your permanent pool volume would be the sum of all of those lakes. And once you hit 200, you've maxed out the ability of the lake to treat for water quality.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right, next up we have Mike, followed by Tyler. Mike Weeksner, you can go ahead and unmute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay, again, an excellent presentation. And I have a couple of questions. Spent a couple hours, with you guys on the 4th and today. Is there any chance that we could get continuing education credit for this sessions?
No, unfortunately, we're not offering continuing education credits. We're not a provider.
Can you be?
We cannot. No, I apologize.
The next question is, with Florida being broken up by zones, on your presentation, it says South Florida Water Management District. Is this specific just to this district, or what about all of Florida? It seems like this applies to all of Florida, doesn't it?
Yes.
Well, the rule does apply to all, but the volume 2 that we talked about is specific to South Florida Water Management District.
And how many agencies are connected to that district that we would go through for ERP approvals?
You would go to one district based on your location. So for instance, if you're in any of the 16 counties that are served by our water management district, you would come to us for an ERP. If you're in Jacksonville, for instance, you would go to the St. Johns River Water Management District, et cetera, et cetera.
Could you provide a breakdown of that? And I'm just curious why the districts haven't been broken up by the zones.
Well, can we provide a breakdown for that? That is available. That's publicly available information, sir. You can easily Google Florida Water Management Districts and you'll come across a map that shows the geographic limits of each of the 5 districts. As far as why the district boundaries don't match the zones, our district boundaries are based on hydrologic boundaries, not based on rainfall.
Okay.
So
is this distinguished in HUC 12 between South Florida and North Florida?
no, sir. The HUCs are where they are, and some HUCs fall across district boundaries. So you might have a project that's in a HUC that is served by at least 2 water management districts, maybe even 3.
Okay. And if we have questions on usage, are there sufficient training modules in the HUC 12?
I don't know. We don't maintain, the HUC 12 map is developed and maintained by USGS. Are you referring to the GIS utility that we've alluded to?
Yeah, I tried to use it after the presentation 2 days ago, and I didn't feel like it was very user friendly. And I've got a bunch of projects in South Florida, and all of this applies to those projects, and I need to get some help with using that software. And it's, you guys make it sound like it's falling off a log, but there's a lot of detail on there, and we're trying to explain it to clients that have no idea what we're talking about.
So that particular utility was created and maintained by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. They have a GIS group. I do not have contact info for them as we sit here. If you've got projects that are going to need ERPs within our water management district, I highly recommend you schedule pre-application meetings. We can discuss some of the details of those projects. There will be a limitation to how much training we can give, however.
Yeah, I'm not talking about necessarily training. The training was excellent with this. It's just being able to use it. That's the main thing. The other thing is, one of my projects involves land use that's right on a waterway. And I'm assuming that we have to get the TP and the TN for the waterway. Since the water table is right at grade elevation, we got to get the water table. And then, is that correct?
I think that questions like that would best be answered in a pre-application meeting. This is intended to be a little higher level.
Okay. Well, I think you guys haven't been involved in some of this that's going on in South Florida. That's why I'm asking. All right. One more question. Okay. If there's an existing stormwater system on property in South Florida, regardless of the history on it, can we tie into it if we have runoff?
That's really an issue of whether or not you're authorized to do so by whoever owns that system. So we're starting to move over into almost a legal question.
Well,
we do not grant any rights of ingress, egress, or the ability to connect to somebody else's property. That is an obligation of the applicant to determine.
This is on the easement of the owner's property.
Sir, again, this sounds like we need to have a one-on-one meeting. We've got about 400 folks on this call who also have questions.
Okay, well, you guys are doing a great job, and this is great information, and I appreciate it.
All right, moving on. So we have Tyler next, followed by Ann. Tyler, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, this is Tyler. Thank you for taking my question. My first question is, how are you guys interpreting impaired waters for the performance requirements? Are they waters not attaining standards, or are they the verified impaired waters? Because those two are not the same thing.
Well, in the context of this utility, they are. I believe that the GIS utility that we keep discussing, when you click on it and you see that you're in a WNAS, those have been identified as verified. So to answer your question, the rule house is looking at the verified list, but those utilities have been adjusted to account for that.
Okay. And then my second question. So Appendix O of Applicant's Handbook Volume 2 provides a list of traditional BMPs for nutrient removal. Dry detention is not included on the list, so it appears that dry detention is no longer an acceptable BMP for nutrient removal. When modifying a site with an existing permitted dry detention BMP or any other previously permitted BMP that appears to no longer be listed as a nutrient removal BMP or has a potentially reduced removal efficiency, how is the nutrient removal performance requirement calculated?
we would not allocate any kind of reduction credit to the existing dry detention. You are correct. It is no longer a water quality treatment BMP. Studies by the folks at DEP over the years have shown that it is not an effective mechanism for removing nitrogen and phosphorus.
Okay, so I would be on the hook for the additional water quality that the BMP that was previously permitted for water quality because it no longer provides the nutrient removal efficiency in the new rules.
Short answer is yes.
Thank you.
All right. Next up, we have Ann, followed by Macron. Ann Schwartz, you can unmute. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate the comprehensive presentation. It's been great. Just wondering, in projects to date where we've been doing the necessary calculations and load reduction analysis, we've been using BMP trains. And I'm just wanting to make sure that that's an acceptable software. It's my understanding that they have been coordinated all along with the DEP EMC values, but just wanted to make sure.
Jess, you want me to handle that one?
No, I got it, Glenn. So BMP trains is still an acceptable method. The current version that we accept is version 4.3.5, which is now available through the DOT's website. I apologize, I don't have a link to share with you all now, but I think you can find it pretty easily. However, the EMC values in BMP trains do not align with the values in table 9.2. So when you make use of BMP trains, you will need to use a user-defined value for EMCs. You'll no longer use the drop-down menu of default land uses. And then the user-defined values you select are going to be the ones that are from that table. Everything else in BMP trains is still in line with the rule. The various interpolations it does to find runoff coefficients and efficiencies are still valid.
And I'm sorry, I caught, you said that's on the FDOT
Correct.
website? Okay. Previously, I've gone to the UCF, I think it's Stormwater Academy. I can't remember if that's the right word.
It is UCF Stormwater stopped hosting that model several months ago. And
Okay.
it was in limbo for a while, but over the last several weeks, it's reappeared. DOT has become the steward for it, at least as far as hosting it. But again, it's important to note that it's version 4.3.5. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Next, we have Macron, followed by John.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
I have two questions. The first question is, we can still use BMP train software, right? To do most of these calculations instead of doing it by hand.
Correct.
And my second question is, what if we have depressions in the existing condition? How would that affect the preloading?
In the precondition, your depressions, that's an excellent question. And potentially, you could look at that in terms of your curve number. There may be other ways to account for those in something like BMP trains, but what it would do is most likely lower your runoff coefficient in some way.
So should we account for depressions or just the land use, assuming everything is going out?
I think the most straightforward thing would be to account for it under land use.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
All right. Next up, we have John, followed by Myra. John Famera, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. All right, he put his hand down. So Myra, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. And you'll be followed by Mark. Myra de Torres, you can unmute. All right. Mark, you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
There we go, the unmute, there was a pop-up for it. I was wondering how that was going to work. Yeah, appreciate the presentation. Just a couple quick questions. Might follow up on the depression comment, a little bit more detailed as far as if you've got a landlocked basin that you do not discharge for your 100-year storm events. I would presume that you're not discharging in pre, you're not discharging in post, so your pre and post loads are zero in both cases, or is there something different that needs to be done there?
For that, you would need to do an analysis, not based on a single storm event, but based on that rainfall period of record that was used to establish the isopleths. And you'd have to demonstrate that under those circumstances, over the course of a year, that you do not discharge.
Okay, so you'd have to do an annual storm event.
Correct.
Okay.
The reference that was mentioned during the design examples, the DEP's report on the evaluation of stormwater criteria in Florida from 2007 provides the various rainfall data. I believe the period of record in some cases is as long as 40 years that was used to develop that. So what you would do is essentially continue a simulation of an average year, plugging in each of those rainfall events to your project and demonstrating that it at no time discharges.
Okay. Sounds complicated. Second question, with the just your normal reductions for phosphorus and nitrogen, is your standard water quality your 1 inch over your basin area, your 2.5 inch times your percent impervious? Is that still a calculation that's still needed, or is this somewhat supersede that?
Yeah, that is no longer necessary. This load-based performance standard supersedes all of our previous volumetric requirements.
Okay. All right. And during the presentation, you were talking about the permanent pool being able to go as deep as you dig in the pond. We all know a lot of sites dig deeper to get fill for the site. We've gotten some pushback out of the Orlando office, and we couldn't go any more than 12 feet for that permanent pool volume due to anoxic or anaeroxic things happening deeper than 10 or 12 feet. Has that been maybe worked out with all of the offices, so people are letting you go down to the depth of the pond that you're digging?
So the original methodology in that 2007 report did look at a limit due to anoxic conditions, and there was a whole series of calculations that had to go in to come up with an effective permanent pool. When DEP, put out the rule, they simplified things, and that's one of the reasons why we have a 200-day limit.
Yep. Okay. So the 200-day kind of limits you there.
Correct.
Okay. Well, I think that's all I had. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you. All right, we're going to try Myra de Torres again. You can go ahead and unmute yourself if you're on. All right, we're going to move on to Markley. Markley, you can unmute yourself, and that'll be followed by Lisa.
Hey, hi, can you guys hear me?
We can.
All right, yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. Well, I had two questions. One of them was already answered regarding the current BMP software that we get. Well, I was wondering if we can still use that software, which I believe was already answered. Now, my next question is regarding the recovery. Now, Now, I've permitted projects through St. John's before, and from the geotechnical reports, we can get infiltration rates, with feet per day, which we can input into our software. And of course, South Florida is more of the hydraulic conductivity, the K values. Are we in a situation where our geotechnical reports would have to include infiltration rates now, or is there maybe some kind of a conversion factor that we can convert K values into infiltration rates or feet per day?
So I am not aware of a conversion factor from hydraulic conductivity to
Infiltration rates.
infiltration rates. That said, hydraulic conductivity is not the only thing we look at or accept. It is just inherent in the exfiltration trench calculation.
Mhm.
So if you have geotech and it demonstrates an infiltration rate for your site, that can be used in any appropriate analysis for recovery.
Okay. All right. All right. That's all I have for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next up, we have Lisa, and you'll be followed by Joshua.
Can you guys hear me?
You're a little faint, but we can hear you.
Okay. My question was regarding a comment that was made at the beginning of the presentation about treating impairments that are not phosphorus and nitrogen. How are you guys wanting us to calculate that and show that to you?
So for non-nutrient based impairments, quite candidly, we don't really have a method. That is something that is going to be placed back on the applicant to demonstrate that the pre-post for whatever that impairment is met. So there could be a variety of impairments, and some of it, I'll just share that, one thing that we have accepted in the past with fecal coliform, for instance, is that a site is going to make use of wastewater treatment. It's going to connect up to a force main. And at that point, there's a presumption that there will not be an increase in fecal coliform off of that site for that reason. So those analyses and those requirements are a little more broad at this point. And I know it's a bit of a cop-out answer, but I think we're going to have to look at those on a case-by-case basis until we have a larger body of experience behind all of us to draw from.
Okay, so that would be something worth talking about in like a pre-application meeting.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, that was
So
all I had. Thank you.
Part of what I would recommend is that when you determine what your impairment is, better understand from DEP's work in listing that water body for that impairment as to why. So heavy metals, copper, fecal, things that do not necessarily tie in very directly to phosphorus and nitrogen. There'll need to be some work done to understand why that basin has been declared impaired for that impairment. Why, have they come up with a root cause? And then you can use that context in the design and presentation of your project to otherwise show that it's not going to add to it. So to some extent, there'll be a narrative level, a qualitative level to some of these discussions of other impairments.
Okay, understood. Thank you.
All right. Next up, we have Joshua, and you'll be followed by Mohammed. Joshua Hughes, you can go ahead. You have a live mic, Joshua. We can't hear you, but you do have a live mic.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So my question was from example 1, I noticed that you subtracted wetland and protected uplands from the catchment area. Is that the only areas that you would subtract from your catchment area?
Yes, but that would depend. So in that particular example, the assumption we're making is that wetland preserve and upland preserve area is not connected to the stormwater management system. It is not contributing nor receiving water from the from the stormwater management system. If you have a project in which your wetlands are being incorporated, then we will need to consider the load from it, the effect on the curve number for the site for those. So it's going to be very specific and very dependent on how you lay out the design of your stormwater management system.
Okay. And I guess to tie into that, if you have a site, let's just say it's light commercial as a land use, but you have a portion of your site that's going to remain undeveloped and undisturbed, do you still count that undisturbed area as light commercial as a whole, or do you separate these land uses within that one project area?
You have the option of separating it out.
Okay.
And
All right,
then choosing an appropriate land use to represent that vacant. What I will say though is that if you or your client are looking to future development of it, and it really depends on what you're seeking an authorization for from the agency, it might be in your best interest to assume it in a developed condition so it's already taken care of down the road.
Okay, and then I guess if you do it as separate land uses, it's just kind of twice as many calculations.
Potentially, yeah.
And my last question is regarding other best management practices. So like if we want to incorporate nutrient reduction baffle box, would you just be looking for the manufacturer's stated efficiency of those devices, or what do you use to incorporate that into our calculations?
So in Appendix O, there is a table that describes, I'll say the more common BMPs, and on that list are a few generations of baffle boxes.
Okay.
At least two of those generations, there are prescribed reduction amounts. They are limited by rule. There is another, I think it's the third generation, that may be a little more of a prove it up type of category. So it does depend on the level of technology that you're using as to what you're going to have to provide us. But if you choose one of the BMPs that has a pre-programmed rate, then it doesn't, there's no need to justify that amount.
Okay, and if it's not a pre-programmed rate, we just you're going to be expecting manufacturers' documentation on efficiency?
Correct.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. That's all the questions I had.
All right, thank you. Next we have Mohammed, followed by Carl.
Hi, my question is, do we need to provide nutrient load reduction prior to drain into a drainage well?
Yes.
Okay, and my second question is drainage well discussed in volume 1 or volume 2 manual?
No, it isn't.
Okay, thank you.
All right, next up we have Carl, followed by Elias.
Hi, yes, I just have a couple of questions, and the guy before Mohammed there touched on one. The first one, just many BMPs in Appendix O include methods for calculating removal efficiencies. However, like baffle boxes and separators, they provide a removal rate. What treatment storm or treatment flow rate, not peak or bypass flow rate, should these products be designed to?
That I think would be part of the specification from the vendor as to what the allowable velocities are.
So I'm with ADS. So we have a treatment flow rate, but not like there's certain storms that you do. Like a lot of the country will designate what type of storm, like a first flush storm or, a 5-year storm. But as of I'm aware, there's no designation on what type of storm those should be designed to. Does that make sense?
I think so, but at this point in time, we've, statewide, there has not been a design storm established for the use of baffle box type structures.
Okay. Okay.
So again, for the projects, the baffle boxes that have a specified rate, it will be incumbent on the engineer of record to make sure that they're using the right tool for the job, as it relates to everything else. For those baffle boxes where the efficiency rate has to be determined, really the same basic answer. The design professional is responsible to make sure that they're using, speccing the correct tool.
Okay. That leads me into the second one that the guy before Muhammad kind of touched on. I was under the impression that until the DEP cistern program becomes active and like similar to current approaches with media-based BMPs, if we had third-party testing data demonstrating nutrient removal rates, that they would be accepted for BMP such as baffle boxes or separators, especially Gen 2 separators.
I do not have quite the same understanding as you. I know that the DEP is continuing to work on that cistern program. And then whenever they're up and running, they'll be accepting submittals from folks to evaluate things. But I did not understand that in the interim, we would be accepting those. It's going to be a case-by-case basis, and those there's going to need to be backup documentation for whatever efficiency the design engineer indicates that particular product will provide.
Okay, thanks. And I'm not saying I'm right in this. Just want to clarify that. And then just last question. Similar to removal rates or with wet ponds and residence time, or inversely related to flow rate. Oh, sorry. Let me just add that. So similar to wet ponds, where residence time like dictates the removal efficiency. With media, it's similar or inversely proportional to flow rate. Is the district correlating media with flow rates or checking against it?
I don't know that we are. I think, again, at present, we're going to rely on the engineer that signs and seals the design, that they're applying those tools correctly.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all very much. It's been a great series here.
All right. Next we have Elias, followed by Randy. Go ahead.
Actually, this is Mark. Sorry.
That's okay.
This was excellent. Jesse doing a great job fielding the questions. Glenn, thank you for running through the math. Real quick, because Glenn had mentioned on table 9.2, standardized statewide EMCs, airport pavement. I just did a quick Google search. Am I to use highway or light industrial? Or there's actually numbers that I was able to pull up for total nitrogen and total phosphorus. Again, it was very specific. We're supposed to use table 9.2.
Yeah, and so, and Glenn, I would appreciate your help on this when I get through. For uses that are very specific, such as airport runways, it may not be as easy as plucking a number off the table. We may have to look more closely. I know Glenn, did a great job of reinforcing the idea that we have to understand what those land uses in the table mean. There are definitions and descriptions. I don't know if airport runway is included in any of the entries we've got. So Glenn, have you got any more insight?
Yeah, so couple things. Unless I am misspeaking, the airside airport general permit is still available to applicants to use to demonstrate state water quality standards for things on the air side of an airfield, including taxiways, runways, and hangars and things like that. So that GP is still out there. It's not negated by these new performance standards. As far as actual load reductions for a taxiway, well, that was the whole reason why the FAA and the DOT and folks got together to evaluate what comes off of an airfield.
Right. I remember
And
all of those studies going on. I'm sorry to
yeah,
interrupt.
and they've been updated. There's been
Yep.
updates to the GP and the manual that goes along with the GP. In
Right.
fact, I thought we saw something earlier this year, some guidance on these updates and analysis to using that GP and the manual that goes with it. So I would go there first if you're truly trying to figure out what is the load coming off of an airfield, go look at that study. Now I'm going to date myself a little bit, and the original author of that study and I had a lunch meeting, gosh, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago,
Yeah.
and that was one of the things he explained was, well, our results tell us nitrogen and phosphorus is not coming off the airfield because we don't fertilize airfields, but
Right.
metals do. Copper becomes the problem primarily with airfields and other heavy metals. And so it's not generally a nitrogen and phosphorus issue for an airfield. It's the heavy metals.
Okay. Final question, and it relates
I'm
to
sorry, or Mark, before we continue. So in this situation, since we do not have a land use in that table that well represents, that those surfaces, what I would indicate, and supplement Glenn with is that uh, in addition to that table, you can use, studies. So it sounds like in this case, if you had a project, you would present to us any reasonable study that
okay.
defines what the load coming off of a runway would be. And we would be looking to DOT, FAA, sources like that.
Okay. I think I'm following the logic behind this. Again, you guys are not in the trenches with the reviewers, and I just want to make certain. And again, it's a slight nuance between highway as to what I just pulled up for total nitrogen, total phosphorus. But again, every little bit helps when you're doing this. Follow-up question. And there was a woman that had asked it earlier. Should you have an exfiltration trench that is connected, well, I call them Siamese, two inlets, an exfiltration trench, no discharge, but right down to the groundwater. Again, DOT District 6 or Miami-Dade. By virtue of me taking that water offline and no longer discharging in existing condition, does that negate my loading, my total nitrogen, total phosphorus loading?
Short answer is no.
Okay, so you still got to run the math.
The long answer is you would have to demonstrate that a year's worth of rain per the ISOCLEF maps
Yep,
does not lead to discharge.
got
If
it.
you meet that condition, then
I got
yes,
it.
you have met the
I
criteria.
kind of my first question was just getting the nuance. The second one was demonstrated in your actual ERP application with calculations.
Correct.
Got it. I'm good. Thank you guys.
No problem. So we're almost out of time, so we have time for just two more questions. So we're going to have Randy and then followed by Mark. So Randy, go ahead with your question, please.
All right, thank you. And Jess, Glenn, thank you very much. This is very informative, including the Q&A. There are two items that I wanted to ask. Glenn, you had an example earlier today regarding a set aside for, I'm assuming, some uplands. In the event that you wanted to utilize irrigation type water, but not really irrigation water, if you wanted to use your lake water to to pump it onto that uplands, would you be limited to the amount of water for your irrigation calculations on that?
So I think I covered that in the stormwater harvesting BMP. So, and as one of the questioners early on realized the relationship between what you retain in the pond and what area you're able to irrigate, you've got to balance those two things. And so, the typical engineer is going to want to do a Blaney-Criddle or some other type of analysis to establish, well, how much water do I need to irrigate the area I need to irrigate? Um, and so that's really up to the design professional to determine how much irrigation water they need and what source they're going to use. And so whether they're going to use groundwater in combination with stormwater harvesting, or what percentages of each. Again, that's a balancing act the design professional needs to do with the sizing of their stormwater harvesting BMP and how much water they want to use in that retention BMP to meet the load reduction requirements. And again, as I pointed out, each time you want to do that, you will need a companion consumptive use permit where you've calculated what your allocation needs are and where you're going to get it from.
No,
I hope.
I did understand that earlier when you were bringing that up. I
Okay.
was
What am I missing?
curious if you are not utilizing this for your standard turf irrigation, pumping it out of the lake and storing it into an area, an undeveloped section of your site where you are more or less retaining more volume of water than what would normally be allowed for irrigation. But again, it's not a turf situation.
It sounds like what you're describing is nothing more than simple retention.
Yeah. Okay.
Retention is retention.
All righty. All right. Perfect. That helps. The other question is, there are many places that we're required to take in reclaimed water from a local utility. How does this impact our nutrient removal criteria? Because we are going to be now introducing a certain amount of nutrient runoff from a reclaimed water main source directly into our wet detention pond.
Jess, you want to tackle it or shall I?
Go ahead.
All right. So it's my understanding as a reviewer here at the agency, and I think I permitted one of the early on projects that this project problem came up in about 2009 or 2010. So at this time, the DEP has directed the 5 districts not to consider that it's part of this water quality performance standard. So we do not look at the incoming nutrients from reclaimed wastewater at this time.
Okay. How would that impact future monitoring and verifying that the water management system design is still meeting the design intent originally permitted?
I'll go ahead and
I'll
answer.
take that one.
Okay, thank you.
ERPs are not issued with monitoring requirements except in very, very specific circumstances. So at the project level, through your ERP, there will not be monitoring. Now, if you're looking at a more regional monitoring, we don't have an answer to that. If the end of some pipe or a sample taken in a water body someplace downstream comes back hot for TP or TN, then, the source of that is going to want to be understood. But as to what will happen as a reaction to that, we do not know.
Okay. Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
All right, and last question for today, Mark.
Hi again. I just have one more question. I was part of the presentation that was on Tuesday as well, and someone earlier asked about treatment of things that aren't nitrogen or phosphorus. I could have swore during the Q&A someone asked the same thing, and someone answered, as long as we follow the flow chart that that specifies like the more governing percent removal, that would be fine for now until something more concrete was developed. But am I misunderstanding that?
Yeah, well, it may not be your misunderstanding. We may have miscommunicated it on Tuesday. So again, for those rule requirements where the impairment itself has to be looked at, we do need reasonable assurance that the site is not going to contribute and increase that. What we have used in the past is the idea that controlling phosphorus and nitrogen will lead to a control of other impairments. But to be on the safe side, if you are in a basin that is impaired and you have to address something other than phosphorus and nitrogen, it will be in your client's best interest to have at least a qualitative demonstration that the impairment is being reduced.
Okay. Is there anything more concrete that's currently being worked on to, to calculate these to where, we're not just like submitting and then we don't really know one way or the other if, it's going to be approved or not? Because, this makes like a big difference in, what kind of BMPs we use and how we like do our site design. And, I wouldn't want to submit something that, I'm like way off on how I'm determining, things that aren't nitrogen or phosphorus and what's coming in. You know what I'm saying?
I think I do, and the answer is I don't know of anything that's being developed.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you. Well, that concludes our presentation today. If anyone does have any follow-up questions, the email address on the screen can be used to send those to. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. And to those of you who also joined us Tuesday morning, thank you for joining us both days. As we shared, we will be sharing the design examples both from Tuesday and this afternoon. We did have different design examples on Tuesday and the presentation with all of the attendees. So thank you and have a good afternoon.